So, okay, for this final session, we are going to seamlessly merge from a short paper by Ryan Baker and George Siemens. And Ryan Baker sends his apologies. Unfortunately, he has a family situation which meant he couldn't be with us, which he's very disappointed about. But we have, from my right, George Siemens, who you know, of course. Then we have David Wiley, John Stamper, and Eric Duval, fresh in from the airport, from the immigration queue. He's one of those guys you want to pull out and put through the detailed scanner, you can tell. Right. What we're going to do is have a short paper, which Ryan and George have put together, which explores this relationship between LAK and this other community called educational data mining, who have been around a little bit longer than us, are interested in big data and learning, and sounds awfully similar to what we're trying to do. So what's the point? Why are we doing LAK when there's already this perfectly good EDM community out there? We have SOLAR and our own conference. They've got the International Educational Data Mining Society and their own conference. So what should the relationship be between the two of us? What are the similarities and differences? And that's really why we're here. So I'm going to ask George to kick off with the paper that he wrote with Ryan. He's going to also be Ryan as well. Then we'll move into a panel discussion where we can obviously pick up on some of those ideas. But as you'll see on the link at the bottom, for mysterious reasons, the final panel paper didn't make it into the proceedings, so you can grab it from there. And that's got some brief position statements from all the panelists. Okay, so I'm not really going to do anything else except welcome George on board, and let's go.
Okay, well, as Simon already mentioned, Ryan very much sends his regrets at not being able to attend. And so I'll try and cover, we obviously put the paper and the slides together, so I'll try and cover his position, but John will possibly step in and go into greater detail on areas that I've perhaps glossed over during the presentation. Just so you're aware of how the session's going to work here, right after I'm done, I'll happily step off stage and then we'll let the panelists work through the, because it'll be a bloodbath and I don't want to be anywhere near that kind of violence. So if you step back a little bit and you look at the two communities, some of you were at our Learning Analytics Conference in Banff in 2011. And that's when we first kicked things off. We started our planning in 2010, but the official conference was done in 2011, first time around. The educational data mining community has a longer history. They ran as an adjunct event, if you will, for several years, and they did their first conference in 2008, and then they started publishing the Journal of Educational Data Mining, which I'll provide some references to shortly as well, in 2009. The two communities, as Ryan already touched on, there's a shared interest around big data and analytics, and what does it mean to learning, and what does it mean to the learning process. We also have, I think, a shared vision that exists, I think, within both communities, and that's this emphasis on discovering new ways of understanding learning and what impacts learning and what's the impact of certain kinds of interventions and what kind of activities that we engage in when we're involved in either a classroom or an online setting. How do these activities help to better plan future teaching approaches or future teaching models or learning models in general? Another point, and this is one of these better words that's very hard to define, but obviously to develop models of understanding or better models of assessing learner activity and learner performance along multiple levels. So rather than emphasizing sort of one particular approach to learning, to really try and get at the breadth of learning comprehension understanding. And obviously with many of the sessions that you've attended already, you're seeing, I hope, a bit of that, trying to tease at more of the assessment model than what you get with the traditional assessment approach. And the other aspect is better support of real-time real-time support for learners, and I think could be emphasized educators as well, particularly in a classroom setting where real-time data could be important in the approaches that they take to their teaching. So to step back from that broadly then and say, well, what is the educational data mining community? It has been around for a period of time, and what are they doing, and what are some of their missions and their goals? The way that the educational data mining community defines itself is it's an emerging discipline. They're concerned with developing methods for exploring unique types of data that come from educational settings, and using those methods to better understand students and the settings in which they learn. So there's that contextual emphasis, but there's certainly the emphasis on looking at multiple types of data. As we've heard numerous times throughout the event, this data exhaust that gets thrown off as we interact in environments that have a digital dimension to it, or at least that can be captured digitally, even if it occurs in a physical environment. Some of the EDM methods and techniques, this comes out of an article that Baker and Yasif did in 2009, and this is also in their educational data mining handbook. If you've seen that particular handbook, they explore this in more detail there. But we're looking at predictions, and the emphasis on prediction seems to be a fairly topical aspect within educational or analytics discourse. And I think it's to a degree a bit uncertain to the level that you can predict complex social activities and the outcomes that they might produce. Because when you're dealing with humans, all it takes is one 90-degree turn and suddenly your prediction models are suffering a bit. And that's something that we face as well, and I'll talk a little bit more about the learning analytics prediction focus. Clustering, relationship mining, and a big emphasis here is distilling the data for human judgment. But another point that Ryan emphasizes a fair bit, and John can comment more so how broad this is within the EDM community, is on discovery with models. There's a lot of emphasis on modeling. Now, Ryan's mentioned that more recently. He's had a transition in some of his thinking where he's looking more at latent knowledge discovery. And then we would probably use the term in the LA community, we'd use the word semantic analysis or semantic focus, but it's knowledge structure discovery that they're emphasizing to a growing degree as well. If you want to look more at EDM papers, you can look at educationaldatamining.org. They have all of their proceedings from previous conferences available online as well. Learning analytics then, in contrast, or actually in similarity probably, focuses on measuring, collecting, and analyzing around and reporting about the data that's being produced by learners in the context that they're that they're involved in, and the intent is to understand and to optimize the learning process, and also to influence, to some degree that's possible, the actual context in which the learning happens. There's a variety of LA methods. I'm not going to go through these in detail. You can just look at the paper if that's the sort of thing you're interested in. But there's a variety of approaches that people in the LA community have adopted and are, I think, starting to adopt to a greater degree. Everything ranging from a network analysis, whether it's social structures, information structures, or the influential contribution of a student or an educator, to content analysis, to personalization adaptation, looking particularly at the sense-making dimension, where, you know, in my perspective at least, the benefit of analytics is not necessarily in providing an answer, but in providing a context to ask better questions. And then, of course, something that's becoming prominent, as I mentioned, in EDM as well, is this prediction focus. And in LA, the prediction is generally tied to some kind of an intervention model. And I'm sure that exists within EDM as well, but from my reading of much of the literature, it's not as prominent as it is within EDM or within learning analytics. So there's a few things to emphasize in terms of distinctions. So these are the intent here as we were talking through this as well. Ryan and I were looking at this, is how do we emphasize that on the one hand these are unique spaces with unique potential outcomes, but there's still enough overlap and there's still enough cross-tool work. And we were sitting down one day and we were looking at what kinds of tools would someone in EDM use and what kind of tools would someone in learning analytics use. And it was obviously a different suite of tools and different set of influence. But it's emphasizing that the methods we're talking about here are used respectively in different communities, so there's a fair bit of overlap. Learning analytics, much of the emphasis comes from social network, semantic web, term intelligent curriculum, if you can use that appropriately, outcome prediction, and emphasizing systemic interventions. Whereas in EDM, it comes strongly from the educational software and student modeling space, and also emphasizing predicting course outcomes. Again, not going into a lot of detail, but a few important distinctions, though, is that in LAK, it's about emphasizing and leveraging, supporting human judgment. So we're trying to automate discovery so that we can better improve the human judgment process. And if you flip it to EDM, automated discovery is important. Leveraging human judgment sort of serves a reverse role from what it does within LAK. And the other term, and Ryan, I've talked to him about this as well, he uses a term to describe that EDM is more reductionist. And I've also mentioned that reductionist is not necessarily a term that always has positive connotations in certain spaces, but he feels that there's value to be learned from the reductionist, or that approach of looking at the small detailed elements in which that's involved. And these aren't just simple differences. These lead to different research methodologies, and they also lead to the development of different tools. So within LAK, we're emphasizing understanding systems as their whole. We're really, this has come across several times from the podium and in conversations I've been involved with, this term of holistic. There's this recognition that we're trying to understand multiple agents and how those agents interact and how that influences learning. Whereas EDM has the emphasis on reducing components to a greater degree so you better understand the individual elements. So within LAK, we have a strong emphasis on informing and empowering both educators and students, and then hopefully influencing the actual design of both learning and the learning system. EDM is looking at automated adaptation. So there is a focus where the human might not necessarily be in the loop in some of the EDM activities. So the question then from our end is it beneficial to have both communities? We think it is, but they've emerged organically. There is a different set of people who are contributing in each of the spaces, and there's not an extensive amount of overlap between the two at this stage. I'll skip through a few of these quickly just for the sake of time and focus on paths to the future. So if we have these two communities, EDM, there's LAK, and the related parent communities of each of those two conference series so far. There's a few approaches going forward in this regard, and this isn't unusual in sort of many science spaces, is how do people who are developing similar ideas simultaneously, each sort of developing their own footprint and their own identity, how do they begin to become supporters of one another or enemies of each other? So we're proposing sort of three approaches that might make sense going forward. So this is, we're advocating for one, but this is how things could play out. Do you have a winner and a loser? Or you have a merger, or you have friendly competition. So winner and a loser, this is not our most desirable approach forward, but it doesn't have to be the outcome that you have the emergence of sort of, we won, you guys lost, and this is the outcome. Part of the reason is there's a lot of inefficiencies involved in this process, and also once you start to develop a tribalistic mentality, you don't necessarily have that sort of sharing and exchange and openness around information. And that's one of the reasons why, particularly as we're putting together this panel, and kudos to the conference organizing committee and the program chairs for LAK 12 in making sure we brought in EDM representation in order to sort of demonstrate our interest in being a part of what they're doing and understanding how what's happening in their space can help us make decisions and vice versa. Also, and I think this is a key point, what you end up doing is instead of pursuing sort of a scientific understanding of learning, the transition becomes one of a political maneuvering approach and a model. And that's not horribly helpful because in certain cases, for those of you that recall the artificial intelligence movement when Papert and who was it? Negroponte, I believe, ended up killing what ended up being the artificial intelligence model that survived, but they initially killed it and abandoned research in that space for a decade plus before they realized, oh crap, actually that guy was right all along. Whoops, but we're still going to keep your, I don't know, $300 million. So that's, I think, one of the areas or the concerns that exist when you have these kinds of conversations is that you don't want it to become a political effort. You want it to remain a scientific effort where discovery is important. The other option is a merger. Now, we aren't far enough along in order to really advocate for mergers. We're just thinking what ifs. It's uncertain at this stage whether learning analytics is actually going to become a distinct field of study or a distinct field of research in the long term. It may be that the techniques are appropriated into respective fields and you don't necessarily have this as a distinct discipline. Obviously, with announcing a journal and a conference and a society, you would think we've sort of revealed our hand as members involved in LAK early on what our interests are, but it's worth emphasizing that things can play out differently. So if this is the case, we've got two different values in different communities. Which communities, if you're going to merge, how do you end up blending those two together? How do the Democrats and the Republicans become one governing party? So these are kinds of things where it gets difficult to actually try and make sense because different values emerge, especially because it's been organically developed. And a few final slides to emphasize. The one that I think we favor is this model of friendly competition, where we are aware that activity is going on within EDM space. We haven't actually seen, and Shane may do an overview of this tomorrow. He has, with his few of his staff, developed actually a really good visualization of the network connections, the citation connections between the LAK 11, LAK 12, and submissions that we've received so far, which papers are drawing attention, which ones aren't. And the EDM community is not extensively referenced in the LAK community. I haven't bothered looking at EDM's papers and the citations back to LAK community. I suspect because we're still fairly new and only have a few publications out, it's likely not going to be substantive. So a sign of success for friendly competition is that we're learning from one another, citing one another, but still developing individual approaches, individual techniques where it's appropriate. The intent then for working together is, first of all, emphasizing some opportunities for quality research. Defining some standards of what constitutes effective research, and we have brought in EDM folks, part of this community as well, in terms of reviewing papers so that we get some insight, and Ryan's been involved in the executive committee for the conference as well. There's certainly a variety of opportunities for capacity development with both EDM and learning analytics, whether it's through master's programs or doctoral seminars or a research lab. That may well be a positive opportunity for us going forward. We've already been involved in a few sort of cross collaborative activities. Ryan and I and John Campbell were involved with the SRI report that was published recently by the U.S. Department of Education on learning analytics and educational data mining. So that was an illustration of the communities coming together. Ryan and I are submitting or have a chapter that will be in the Cambridge Handbook for Learning Sciences that's coming out, I believe it's next year. Again, they're due at the end of this year. So we're cross-publishing within those spaces so that we're getting the identity of both communities being reflected. Now, in theory, as we were planning, Ryan and I, who is definitely not here, we're going to, as a sign of our deep-felt love for one another and our respective communities, he was going to give me a miner's hat, data mining. I was going to give him sunglasses to reflect our desire to work together as a community. But that's just what you get when you're cheesy people. Back to you, Simon.
Okay, thanks very much, George. 5 minutes questions for George. If you just want to pick up on anything he said. Yep, John?
Yeah.
No,
probably the mic for the recording purposes.
For the thousands who are viewing online.
I'm just intrigued about the third community that's not here. And many of the faces that I see around me, I've seen at adaptive hypermedia conferences, faces on stage here. And especially when we're talking about open corpus adaptation, especially when we're talking about social adaptation. And I wonder if we've thought about that third, quite large and quite well-developed community that goes back to the mid-90s.
That's a good point, and I think actually in conversations I've had with you, that has come up in the past as well. We haven't thought about it is the short answer. But the fact that you're raising, and I was speaking with someone, actually Shirley Alexander, if I can call her out. She mentioned as well that, and Simon's touched on this, there's multiple tributaries flowing into what we're calling learning analytics, just like there's multiple tributaries flowing into what's being called EDM. And it probably would be a good idea, Shirley, for someone for LAK 13 to put together a paper that starts to integrate these various communities, and particularly looking at, where are these overlapping spaces between the voices that aren't represented at this particular event here. So short answer, no, but we would like to.
I think I agree with your general assessment, but there's one point that strikes me. You said that both communities have an interest in big data. And I can understand that many people working in learning analytics are motivated by that, working in large online learning institutions and so on. But I see learning analytics as, the way you described it, as informing educators' decisions, as also being appropriate for small data, but maybe really strongly computational supported approach, to decision making with small data. So that might be another distinguishing factor, that data mining is usually only useful when you've got a whole lot of stuff you're trying to figure out. But learning analytics may include microanalysis that's automated, for example.
No, and I'll reference that briefly tomorrow, exactly that concept, which is the importance of small data can't be overlooked, because small data is often, exactly like Dan emphasized, is at the point of the end user. Now, that small data will likely be informed by analytics and models that were developed from large data sets, so that the models that are being run on smaller data sets will influence, sort of the metrics or the evaluation that's being turned out. But I fully agree. There has to be a diversity that's evident there. By the same account, I mean, I see some of the work that is being done with WCET's predictive analytics reporting project. I mean, they're dealing with enormous data sets in that regard, and I'm not sure exactly whether we call that EDM or whether we call that learning analytics. So I think to a degree, it's worth emphasizing that for the purpose of drawing out some distinctions, we're naming things in boxes that don't exclusively belong in boxes. So someday, as humanity continues to mature, we'll develop a language that accounts for fuzziness between concepts and ideas, and they're not exclusively hardened the way definitions do. That's my goal. Sorry.
Hi, George. I was interested in your comment that, we've got sort of overlapping boxes here. I've sort of got a question for the audience, because we've got a LAK conference here, there's an EDM conference. How many people here have been to an EDM conference?
So, 2 hands.
No, there's 4 if you count, yeah.
Oh,
Woohoo!
John's here.
Yeah.
So
we had 200 people here. That's a pretty good percentage.
So we come up with 4 or 5. I mean, something that's concerned me, because I've spent some time looking at the bibliographies of a lot of the papers that came to LAK this year. And I've also looked back at Baker and Youssef's review of educational data mining, in which they identified the top referenced works for educational data mining up to the time, which was about 2005. And there were things which were getting like 110 references. And I don't see those appearing in anybody's work here. So what worries me is that by dividing the two communities, we're ignoring a huge body of work, which is, as we acknowledge, relevant to what we're doing. And what I see is when I go through, people say, yes, we're related to educational data mining. And look, I found this handy review of educational data mining, and I'm going to reference it. And so they sort of tokenistically say, yeah, there's a couple of reviews out there, but I don't get the feeling that anybody's reading the reviews and going back to what's referenced. So really, I'd like to encourage people in the room to take note of what George has said, that there are overlaps between the communities, and we can learn from the educational data mining community. There's a lot of valuable work there, some of which we are replicating. So it's not really a question, George, is it?
Then I'm just going to say thank you.
Okay. All right, let's thank George first. Thank you very much.